Welcome to today's webinar, Ice Out Food Waste, Leveraging the Power of Freezing to Reduce Wasted Food. Today is co-presented by ReFed and the American Frozen Food Institute. We're really excited to have them as a partner in this webinar today. At ReFed, we like to talk about the freezer as the magic pause button. It extends the shelf life of perishable foods. It is one of the easiest things we can do, right? And we are excited today to dive into that a little bit more deeply. And explore kind of how this powerful tool can be leveraged throughout the supply chain to reduce food waste and how frozen food can be a tool for consumers to waste less food. So thank you all for joining us. My name is Dana Gunders. I'm the president here at ReFed. For those of you not familiar with ReFed, we are a nonprofit that is entirely dedicated to wasting less food. And we work with businesses, funders, solution providers, policymakers, and more to help solve food waste. It's a problem that costs all of us a lot of money, has enormous negative impacts on our planet and communities. And our goal is really to increase the adoption of food waste solutions. One way that we help do that is through events like this webinar. And we hope that this can help inform the work that you're all doing out there. But before we get to the conversation, I want to share a few quick ReFed announcements. Starting tomorrow, we are presenting a 3-part Impact Capital Showcase in partnership with our friends at CapShift, who empower financial institutions and their clients to activate capital towards social and environmental change. Each session of the series offers education on different types of funding vehicles and will connect funders with real opportunities to move capital toward high-impact food waste solutions. So we're really excited about this. You can register at the link in the chat. And it's particularly fun because one of the founders of CapShift was actually involved in the early days of ReFed. So fun to be partnering with them again. We also want to remind everyone about about the ReFed Solutions Summit. On May 19th to 21st of next year, we'll be bringing the Food Waste Solutions Summit to Charlotte, North Carolina. It is the premier food waste event of the year. We bring together hundreds of thought leaders, decision makers, advocates, and more. We do field trips. It's incredible energy, and we hope you all can join us. We are really about action at the summit and hope that everyone leaves with, lots to do and lots of connections that they've made. We have tickets on sale now. We are offering a early bird discount through December 14th. So make sure you get your tickets before then. Last year it sold out, so don't take too long. All right, so getting to today. I am excited today to be joined by 3 amazing speakers. We have Kai Robertson. Kai is a senior corporate sustainability advisor. She's a longtime friend of ReFed, and she's been working very closely with the American Frozen Food Institute, looking at the opportunities around wasting less with frozen food. Liz Weiss is a registered dietitian, nutritionist who has been passionate about healthy food, family nutrition, vibrant living for over 30 years. She's an author, she's a blogger, a podcaster, and a wealth of knowledge when it comes to managing food in our homes. And Danielle Reed is a senior sustainability manager at Nature's Touch Frozen Foods, which sells frozen fruits and vegetables as nature intended with no additives or preservatives. So we are excited to welcome all of you in just a moment. Before we do, I'm just going to set the stage for today's conversation by giving a short overview of the food waste challenge in the U.S. for any of you who are kind of new to the topic of food waste. And then I'll hand it over to Kai for more specifically on frozen food. And before we get into some statistics, I want to make sure everyone's aware of what we mean by the term surplus food. So we use that to include anything that's uneaten. We say it's not wasted until it's not food waste until it's wasted, right? A lot of this is perfectly good food. So we talk about surplus food to include the uneaten and inedible parts that get sent to waste destinations like composting, anaerobic digestion, sewer, landfill, And once it gets to those destinations, then we call it food waste. But it also includes all of the food that goes unsold or uneaten by businesses or uneaten at homes or restaurants, food that gets donated, upcycled, fed to animals. That all is included in our definition of surplus food. All right, well, in the US, just to give you some basic numbers here, we estimate that about 31% of our food supply, 74 million tons of food, is considered surplus food. The total value of this food is $382 billion. It is equivalent to 120 billion meals. That's enough to feed 1/3 of all of the US for a year. A critical amount of food, especially in the times we're dealing with right in this moment. However, 85% of this does not go to people, doesn't even go to animals. It goes to waste destinations, the largest of which is landfills, and about 9% of it goes to animal feed. Only 2% of that food gets donated. And that is all happening while about 47 million Americans, 1 in 7, are food insecure. This is a number that is going up these days, not down, unfortunately. And with the current government shutdown, with the gap in SNAP funding, this number is likely to get even higher in the near future. And so the urgency to reduce wasted food has become even more important. Also, the urgency, if you are a business, to donate food, because some of these food banks are actually, all of these food banks are really facing a huge increase in demand. So, if ever there's a time to double down on your food donations, it is right now. Having said that, the majority of surplus food, about 35%, occurs in homes, followed by consumer facing businesses like grocery stores and restaurants at 23%. It's important to call out that as consumers, we are, all 330 million of us are the largest generators of surplus food, more so than any of those food businesses. And if you combine kind of what we don't eat in our homes and what we don't eat in restaurants, like on our plates, consumer food waste accounts for almost 50% of surplus food, which is expensive. The average American spends nearly $780 every year, $782 every year on food that is never eaten, which means a family of four is spending more than $3,000 every year on food that ends up in the trash or maybe the compost. And recent estimates from the EPA are aligned with this figure. One of the reasons, actually, we think we've seen some attention on reducing food waste from the current administration is that it is a good answer to the rising food costs that we're seeing. I will also note that the economic impacts of surplus food go beyond the consumer. So in 2023, food businesses and producers lost around over $100 billion in revenue from food that went unsold or uneaten. Okay, so where is this happening? About 80% of surplus food is perishable. So it's fruits, vegetables, meats, prepared fresh foods like deli items, milk and dairy, as well as some grain products like bread and bakery items. Important for this conversation, frozen food makes up only slightly more than 2% of all the surplus food. And this idea that frozen food is wasted less is confirmed by real data. Analysis from a West Coast project, which is called the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment, um, from all of the grocers that worked on that project, found that between 2019 and 2023, the frozen food department consistently had the lowest loss rate for grocers at just 1%. That was true in the West Coast project. It can also be said for the national level. So data from the US Food Waste Pact, which represents just over half of the grocery segment in the US, also shows that the frozen department has the lowest loss rate of any department at 2%. So somewhere in that 1 to 2% range. And on the right, you can see what this means as far as tons unsold and how much that unsold inventory is worth. This chart is also data from the U. This chart is, sorry, also data from the US Food Waste Pact. The frozen department represents just 3.6% of the total tons of unsold inventory at retail level, and just 4.3% if you're looking at it by value. So what this means is there's some hope when we look at frozen, right? It is performing better than fresh food when it comes to waste. And that's what we really want to dig into today. So I'll close with some hope. The thing about food waste is it is solvable. And there's so many solutions out there that are ready, that are being deployed, ready to scale. Some are very high tech, and some are just putting food in your freezer or maybe buying more frozen foods, right? Our latest analysis, which we released at the beginning of this year, shows that a $16 billion investment over a 10-year period in the 45, we've analyzed 45 food waste solutions. So if we kind of put those all together, we estimate that it would cost about $16 billion annually to invest in those solutions, but that could create a net financial benefit of $60 billion. So that's almost a 4x return on the money that would go into this. At the same time, it would divert 20 million tons of surplus food from the landfill and avoid almost 80 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So there's a lot possible. Wasting less food really hits on so many things. Um, and as I said, I think frozen is a topic. It's an opportunity across the supply chain. So I'm really excited to dig into that a little bit more deeply today. And to start with that, I will pass it to Kai Robertson, who can tell us more about the frozen food industry and some of the analyses they've done on the possibilities for frozen food to help reduce waste. So Kai, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Dana, for the wonderful introduction. And we're so pleased on behalf of AFFI, which is one of my clients, to be co-hosting this with you because, as you said, frozen's a bit of a no-duh solution to reducing food waste, but it's not as top of mind as it could be. And would love to hear from the audience also what are better ways to leverage freezing. I'll talk about why freezing is a great solution, but we want to hear what maybe obstacles are that those of you in the audience encounter, what perceptions maybe get in the way, etc. So given the natural role of freezing, again, the American Frozen Food Institute, also shorthand goes by AFFI, is a trade association. They represent the frozen food manufacturers and distributors in the US, advocate on the Hill, on nutrition, food safety, and business issues, communicate for the sector about the benefits of frozen food, support a number of sustainability initiatives, and also do research on things like nutrition and food safety and sustainability. On the next slide, you'll see that there are 3 priorities on a sustainability front for AFFI. It was part of a materiality analysis that I helped them do a couple of years ago. And the 3 topics that AFFI is focused on to help its member companies and the greater frozen food industry take action are to address the collective energy, waste, and packaging footprint with 3 goals about reducing GHG emissions and energy use, promoting the role of frozen to prevent and reduce food waste, which is what we're talking about today, and also looking at the packaging side of things. And if you want to read more details, they're all online, including some member case studies. So frozen, excuse me, can really help reduce waste across the full value chain. At the ReFed Summit earlier this year, I moderated a panel about food loss on farms. The blueberry grower on the panel gave a great example about having had surplus blueberries and froze them in order to preserve them, extend their shelf life, and find a secondary market for the surplus that he had that year. In the retail and food service side of things, the freezing, basically freezing is a pause, as Dana mentioned. He buys time, so that extends the life of product for retailers and food service businesses to actually have more time to use and sell their purchases. And the same is true for consumers. Whether you home freeze surplus or buy products already frozen, freezing buys us all time to actually use and eat the food we've bought. So a quick slide on the science behind that. The science shows, as Dana mentioned, freezing is nature's pause button. It's a change in temperature. It pauses the enzyme activity, microorganism growth, and oxidation, which prevents the quality from degrading or product from spoiling. And in today's freezing environment, rapid freezing really is a process that is commonly used. It's called IQF, individually quick freezing, if you've heard of that. It ensures that there is high quality taste and texture. And the key piece from a nutrition perspective is that the benefit of freezing is pretty cool, no pun intended, because it locks in nutrition within hours of harvest. You have the opportunity right after harvest to freeze the product, pause any degradation, retain the nutritional value, and also to pick the product at peak ripeness. So that, because if you're selling something, you can imagine the green tomatoes, the green peaches that need to be picked when they're green so they can survive the transport to the store. You don't have to do that for freezing. You can pick it at peak ripeness and freeze it. And so the product we get in the stores when it's frozen commercially are at peak ripeness as well. So in terms of the waste rates, as Dana shared, the retail waste rates are super low at the bottom of the, good to be in the bottom of the barrel for something like food waste for frozen. And a Cornell study also did a meta review and analysis of studies that are out there from both retail and consumer waste rates, concluded that frozen foods are wasted less than their fresh counterparts at grocery stores and in households for most of the time. The level of waste obviously varies across different food categories. The more perishable products like spinach or berries that are more perishable when they're fresh are going to have a much higher waste rate for consumers than something like potatoes that are bought fresh because they have a longer shelf life. So the delta between fresh and frozen might change, but overall, frozen foods are wasted far less than the fresh counterparts. And as well, consumers do see and agree that freezing is a good solution. Freezing foods, including leftovers on their own, like when we just put something we bought elsewhere and put into our freezer, people see that as a good way to reduce food waste and a good way to save money. And then you've got a little over 80% also saying that they buy frozen food with a solution in mind of reducing food waste. That's at least what they say. We also see on the next slide that consumers understand that there's multiple benefits from using frozen ingredients. You can adjust your shopping and your cooking based on your mood, time crunches, prepare more meals at home. You get the flexibility for having a backup plan without the risk of spoilage. So these numbers are in the close to 90% of people seeing that there are a number of benefits. And so the opportunity that I see here is that the consumers do see and understand the value in freezing food. That's an awareness, but we also need to translate that into behaviors and helping people know how to freeze and do it right, and how to cook from frozen. And we'll talk about that in the panel a little bit. And then the second opportunities is that consumers see the value in buying frozen food and that it can reduce food waste, but there's 50% who said we somewhat agree. So there's really an opportunity to reinforce for those who don't think of it as much and it's not as top of mind that this is a great solution to save money and provide lots of other benefits. And for those of you on the phone who are in the hunger relief business, this study also looked at consumers' attitudes among people who are SNAP eligible. Further upstream in the supply chain, it's also really useful to just call out quickly that companies who are in the frozen food business are taking a lot of steps to reduce their own operational food waste. You'll hear from Nature's Touch Frozen Foods on the panel. They did a great waste prevention audit, implemented 13 recommendations. A lot of them were machine-related improvements, and something as simple as like welding a metal plate over a gap between two sections of the processing line saved them $29,000, almost 9,000 kilograms of blueberries a year, and only cost $1,500 to install. Dana mentioned the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment. They also did a case study with Lamb Weston in the potato side of things, and Simplot in Australia and also Simplot in the US has done a lot to look at farm whole chain losses from frozen peas from farm to in the field all the way through to distribution to identify the hot spots. They've come up with products like raspberry crumbles that use little parts of the raspberries that fall apart and sell that into food service as an innovative product. And the key thing here is also not just what what the processors do, but collaborating with customers, the retailers and the food service folks to sell the innovative products that take advantage of all parts of the food. And as importantly, there's really an opportunity to collaborate with the logistics providers. So some of AFFI's members are logistics providers, those who store and transport frozen products. Many of them are working with food banks to either provide cold chain assistance in the form of donated warehouse space, or technical assistance to the food banks in terms of cold storage and energy efficiencies. So there is an organization that AFFI partners with quite a bit called the Global Cold Chain Alliance. Those of you working in the hunger relief food rescue space might be interested to know they're creating for their members a food rescue toolkit. So a lot of collaboration opportunities and ways to work together in the frozen food chain. Last but not least, I just want to share that from a public perception perspective, there is the truth and the perception that frozen food requires high energy use. The trade-off that's really important to understand, and it was shown by an LCA done by Nomad Foods, who's the largest frozen food manufacturer in Europe, is that when you do a comprehensive LCA, the lower rate of waste in the retail and consumer side of things can offset the higher energy use from freezing. So you have less food generating methane when it's rotting in a landfill with lower waste rates, and that offsets the energy that's used earlier in the chain to produce the frozen food. So it's really important to look at the full life cycle. They looked at 22 frozen products, and it went from cradle to grave. More common is to go cradle to gate. It's really important for the LCA practitioners to look at cradle to grave, because then you're taking into account the other activities that offset the carbon footprint. And so mostly this chart on the right shows that the frozen products that they studied were mostly equal or lower carbon footprint than the alternative. So I'll end on that note and turn it back over to Dana to lead us through the panel discussion.
Super, and would love for Liz and Danielle to join us here as well for this. Thank you so much, Kai. Before we leave that chart, I have a question, which is there were some things that said lower, but some that were equal and some that were higher. So are there particular categories of food, like meat versus produce, or like that fell in the higher or lower? You're on mute, Kai.
One of the ones that was at the top of that definitely better carbon footprint was spinach, because spinach, as you can imagine, when we buy it fresh, it is much more likely to spoil before we can use it. I mean, I know often, unfortunately, I end up throwing out spinach leaves. I carefully sort through them, but there's always something that spoils in the fresh spinach leaves. Versus frozen spinach, when I know I always use up the entire frozen package. So the products that where the fresh or the alternative counterpart is inherently more perishable, those tend to rise to the top. Something like fish fingers can be a bit more in the middle, because it's also a higher cost product. And so when you buy fresh fish, you're less likely to not use it and throw it away, because you've invested quite a bit of money in buying the fresh fish to begin with. So the delta between that and frozen fish maybe not as high in terms of waste rates.
And how about the higher? There were a couple in that higher bottom
Yeah,
category.
I'll let me look those up while we're talking, because I can't recall which three products those were, but I will look them up while we're talking, and then I'll drop that in the chat.
All right, sounds good. Great. Well, would love to bring the others in here, and this is really a question for all of you to get us started. So, Kai told us a lot of the great things about frozen and how people, do like it, but at the same time, we kind of know that consumers are not prioritizing frozen foods. So, despite the benefits around shelf life and saving money, reducing waste, it's not happening as much as maybe we'd like to see. And so, what are some of the most common misconceptions that consumers have about packaged frozen food?
Sure.
Yeah, Danielle, let's start with you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Danielle Reed from Nature's Touch. Happy to be invited to be here today. Yeah, I think when it comes to perception issues around frozen, and I'll speak to frozen fruits and vegetables since that's what our company produces, I would say there's kind of three common perception issues. So one is that frozen products are considered to be like less nutritious by some in comparison to fresh, and in the same vein also of a lesser quality. In my experience, that hasn't really been the case. And I think especially over the last 20 years, there's been a really strong improvement in the quality of like what you're seeing in the category. As Kai mentioned, the products are frozen at peak peak freshness, peak ripeness, and that really helps lock in the nutrition and the quality within the product so they're comparable to fresh, or in some cases, even better. And I think the other concern is just the process, the fact that frozen fruits and vegetables are processed. And in this environment right now, I think there's a lot of concerns about like ultra processed fruits and the different impacts of that. So for our products specifically, they do go through a processing, but it's very similar to like how you would process them or prepare them in your own home, just happening at more of an industrial level with fancier equipment essentially. So the products come in, they go through a washing phase, they then get prepped, whether it's, you know, like vegetables going through like a steaming process, or like a mango, for example, would be peeled, pitted, and then sliced or diced, depending on the specification. And then it goes through like a tunnel where it goes through an IQF process. So it just happens on a little bit of a faster scale than maybe like freezing something on a baking sheet in your freezer, as I might do.
Super. And I will say that my 8-year-old son is obsessed with eating frozen fruit. He will take that for dessert like every day. It's those mangoes that you have peeled and pitted for us. I'm very grateful. But I think the nutrition part is a real misconception. So Liz, as a dietitian,
Mhm.
nutritionist, like what do you have to say to those people who are worried? And you know, we've heard from both Danielle and Kai, you know, that there is that we know it's frozen, but kind of what do you like? Can you get a little more specific about the health and nutrition of frozen versus fresh?
Sure, sure. And and I'll agree with Danielle on those barriers, that she just talked about. But when it comes to nutrition, I always say that fresh fruits and veggies are just as nutritious, if not in some cases more nutritious than fresh. So if you really think about it, and Kai touched on this before, frozen produce is frozen at its peak of ripeness. It's picked, it's frozen versus fresh, which is in a truck. It goes from California to Boston, where I live. It's in the grocery store, it's in your refrigerator, and it's starting to degrade. But we know from research, actually a 2015 study that looked at 8 common frozen fruits and veggies, so blueberries, carrots, broccoli, comparing them nutrient-wise to their fresh counterparts. And they found that when it came to nutrients, especially vitamins C and E, the frozen retain those nutrients better than the fresh. So when we say frozen can be more nutritious than fresh, it is so true. And so that's an important thing to communicate to consumers, that it's like nature's pause button. You're getting essentially a fresh product. And the same can be said for prepared meals. And AFFI has done some really fascinating research on this, where they've compared frozen entrees and side dishes. So, meat lasagna is one example, compared those main dishes and side dishes to their homemade counterparts, and found that they are comparable when it comes to nutrition, similar in calories to that homemade version, similar in fat, sodium, nutrients like calcium and vitamins C and vitamins A. And so just, people don't need to feel guilty if they're going to go to the store and buy a prepared meal. And there's so many other benefits too that we can talk about: pre-portioned, less food waste. So consumers can feel really good knowing that processed foods can be a really important component of a healthy diet. We have to destigmatize them. A bag of frozen broccoli is processed, right? So it's fine to include those in the diet. So yeah, so we really need to constantly remind consumers about the nutritional benefits of frozen.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say like I think the destigmatizing, right, that's a really interesting word because I do and I'm curious if you guys have data to support this because this is more just my experience, is that not only is there a thing about the processed, which is interesting because the difference between, you know, a box of mac and cheese or processed food in your pantry, like that has preserved, like some of that processed food needs like additives to preserve it, right? If it's in your pantry to be shelf stable, but if it's in the freezer, it's actually the cold that's preserving it. And so I think there's less need for some of that. I think there's another stigma thing that comes in here just around quality, like premiumness, that somehow it is a higher standard of living if you're buying fresh versus frozen, even if you're cooking it afterwards. And I'm curious if, I don't know if it's AFFI or Danielle, you or Liz, any of you have kind of encountered that and seen any successful ways to get around it, or is that just not true?
I don't know about the research, but I will tell you if you take a bag of frozen broccoli and you, right from the bag, into a bowl, toss it with olive oil, salt, pepper, your favorite seasoning, and then bake it at 425. I always like to toss every 10 minutes or so for even baking. That broccoli is going to come out crisp and delicious and so fresh tasting. And so the more we can share, everyday applications with consumers, the more we can share recipes and they could actually visually see how incredible this looks and how delicious it is. This is where social media can be your friend, by sharing positive messages and positive videos and cooking videos. We just have to constantly, get that message out and just remind consumers that the quality is fantastic. I'm sure Danielle can talk about this. The quality of her product is just so premium. And the fact that it's frozen just hours after it's picked is to me such a great message for the consumer because it is that nature's pause button, truly.
Yeah, and I think what's really important about like our products and frozen produce in general is, in my opinion and my experience, and I think there's a lot of people can probably relate to this. It makes, I think, healthy eating a little easier as well. A lot of that prep is already done for you, and um, there's definitely a big perception issue that stays in place, and I think it's just a matter of people being willing to try something out, trying something new. But yeah, the quality definitely like absolutely stands up, and maybe it's just a matter of like people receiving recipes and like it's always calling for like a fresh ingredient. So sometimes maybe people feel because it's calling for like a fresh broccoli and stuff, like roasted fresh broccoli instead of like a roasted frozen, people might just kind of assume like the frozen product's not an option to fit in. So yeah, I think it's just a matter of trying to be creative and ultimately like have less shame around like what we're eating and how we're preparing it and just focus on getting those nutrients in and having something that tastes great at the end of the day.
Yeah, and consumers love hacks, by the way, and going from that freezer right to the baking dish or the baking sheet and into the oven is such a great quick hack. And so the more we can, give them hacks, whether it's through social media, website information, just supermarket, unpack messaging.
Yeah.
And even too, I will say labeling and packaging. Danielle, because behind you, I see a bag of your frozen raspberries and your berries, and just so beautiful, right? It just looks beautiful. It looks fresh, and that, a picture does paint the true story of what's in that package.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought up hacks. And I see from people's introductions, we have a lot of people on the webinar who are with some food rescue groups
Mhm.
and also, food banks and also local governments. And I think all of those folks are well positioned to get a lot of information out to people about freezing food, frozen food, all of what we're talking about. So I'm curious when you talk about hacks, like what are some other hacks that we can give people to you know, help them use frozen foods or freeze food better, Liz?
Oh, wow. So I would say, well, hacks just in terms of leftovers. Like I would start with that because I think one of the barriers for consumers is not knowing how to freeze leftovers, how to freeze. You've got that, Thanksgiving that's coming up. We just had, Halloween and everybody's been cooking with canned pumpkin and you always end up with like half a can of pumpkin puree. What do I do with that? And then it languishes in the refrigerator and then you end up wasting it. So giving consumers hacks on just how to store and freeze leftovers is huge, right? So going into that freezer bag, squeezing all the air out, freezing food in single layers, quickly, because the quicker you can freeze it, the better. Labeling so you don't find it 7 years later, which, we all know has happened to us. And just, so tips on just how to freeze, not freezing leftover beef stew when it's still warm or hot, cooling it completely. So giving consumers hacks on just proper storage of leftovers into the freezer, and then certainly hacks on cooking. We talked about that bag of frozen broccoli. Just today, I sent my husband to the store yesterday, and I said, get a bag of frozen sliced shiitake mushrooms, because I live near Trader Joe's here in Boston. Off he goes. He gets the mushrooms. He has no idea why or what he's going to do with these mushrooms. And I had to explain to him, you can take those frozen mushrooms and put them right into a hot skillet with some oil. Cook them. The liquid will leach out, just like with a fresh mushroom. They're going to caramelize. You can add them to omelets, into pasta dishes, you name it. So giving people those very simple instructions and hacks on how to go from the freezer directly into the skillet or directly into the oven can go a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see a note in the chat about the other part with the other side, which is helping people remember to use what's in there, right? Like I talk a lot about thinking of your freezer as short-term storage, not long-term, and kind of using it in your regular cycle of the what's for dinner question. It's like, well, open up your freezer. What do you have in there? Um, and someone in the chat is mentioning that they promote using a tracking sheet on the outside of their freezer to help remember what's inside. I've also heard tips of just, really obvious things, using clear containers. Don't put something in a yogurt container because you'll never know what's in it.
Right.
Making sure to label containers is another one that I've heard. So sometimes it's kind of basic. We do have a, a question here from the audience that is I'm just going to read it. One of our food, it looks like it's from a food bank. And they're saying one of our food rescue orgs has piloted a method to freeze surplus food in the harvest season and freeze it for food shelves to use later. They worked with the extension office to be able to skip blanching it if you're vacuum sealing. So do you have any guidelines to freeze specific foods to help similar programs? Or do you know of any?
Hmm.
I think go ahead, Danielle, you're the expert on blanching.
Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't know of any programs specifically, but we have our plant in Montreal, and there's a food bank that we work with locally to manage a lot of our surplus food, Moisson Montréal. They so not really specific to blanching, but they did put in some like repacking equipment to be able to manage like bulk frozen product as it's coming in. And because we did have that relationship with them, they were able to kind of reach out just to like get connected with our maintenance and operations team to learn about like how to use that equipment or some best practices. So while there might not be a formal program, I would recommend like I think people usually are willing to help and share their expertise, especially when it's around a cause like that. So I would recommend maybe reaching out to any local companies that you work with or partners, and I think they'll be willing to lend their expertise.
Super. And there's a few different questions and comments here about the packaging side of frozen. That one of the downsides um, for people is that frozen comes in packaging versus sometimes no packaging, but also that it's like in a film that can be hard to recycle. And so there are some questions around like, is the industry thinking about this? What are some solutions? It is a very wicked problem. I will say before I pass this over that in general, Kai showed that the life cycle analysis of energy versus frozen and the waste reduction benefits. Most of the life cycle analyses I've seen show that the packaging, if it helps less food go to waste, is worth it from a life cycle analysis point of view, that the impact of the food going to waste tends to be higher than the impact of the packaging. But with that question, Danielle, I know you probably have something to say about this.
This is a frequent conversation that I'm involved in from different settings. So absolutely. Yeah, I think the reality is like the packaging does help preserve the product and it does help lead to reduce food waste, and overall that does make its use worth it. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that there's still not a negative impact that comes from the packaging. What at Nature's Touch we were kind of, definitely this is definitely like a sore spot from us, and it's a main uh piece of feedback we hear from like our consumers and our retail customers about the packaging. It's a priority for them as well. We have been in the process of moving all of our products to like a recycle ready packaging, which is a packaging that's designed to be recycled, which I think is an important move. We kind of face a challenge of our products are going into a waste system that's not really designed to manage plastics well, especially flexible packaging. We're seeing a lot of shifts in Canada. Like all of our provinces have moved over to like a new recycling program where producers are essentially responsible for managing the packaging at end of life. And in the US, you're starting to see different states transition to that. In theory, that will lead to better recycling rates and will lead to investments in the technology to capture that packaging that is well designed. But it's a sore spot, and ultimately, like there needs to be more of the packaging that's in the market needs to be designed to be recycled in order to have like a critical mass and enough supply to create a demand for waste companies to invest in the technology to be able to capture and manage that. So it's definitely a challenge, something we are working on. I'm I'm very curious to see how like a reusable packaging could look like in frozen. I think there's a lot of unique challenges with our products just because of the amount of time that the packaging is actually in a consumer's home, in comparison to like other reuse programs. But yeah, so that's kind of like us, like our thought process and how we're managing it. But definitely still an impact there and a lot of work to do to solve for.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. And I see another question about kind of what can you use besides plastic at homes? I know I use glass containers and put them in, like clear glass ones. And I about 10 years ago, I was in Spain and I kind of wandered into a store that was the entire store was bulk frozen food. So it was like trunk freezers with bulk items inside, and you brought your own container, and then you scooped out chicken nuggets, frozen peas, frozen corn. My mind was like, phew, and I've literally never ever like come across the concept since. But who knows, maybe one of these zero waste grocery stores that are starting to come up will do something like that. I thought it was brilliant. Um, there's another question about kind of food service companies or smaller companies that are worried about labor and the cost of labor to do some of this. And if you have any recommendations for, let's say you're a restaurant, right? Like, how should a restaurant be using frozen?
Hmm. Well,
Whether at before, like buying frozen, or should they be freezing some of their stuff as well?
Well, I think for sure freezing leftovers is a great idea, but that's really up to chefs. I mean, I don't know if, I mean, I don't know if you guys are working with culinary schools, but chefs are fantastic at coming up with innovative recipes and applications and new ways of thinking. So having restaurants utilize frozen more, I think would be fantastic. I'm not sure what's really happening out there, if there's any research on that, but I'm sure it's in the end would save them money because restaurants have very low margins, but it makes sense for them to utilize frozen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say like that Simplot example that I showed, raspberry crumbles. That's not only a way to use product that isn't sold because people buy a whole raspberry, but in the food service world, it doesn't matter if it's crumbles because you can just incorporate that into a dessert or into, there's a whole range of creative uses. And in food service, you're not, and like we, the consumer, we're looking for the whole product. I don't know why. Like I'd buy raspberry crumbles, they're just as good, but we have this perception that we, the people, the eaters, can only eat a whole product. So in food service, again, those cosmetic differences or the size differences don't matter as much, and that's where frozen is a great solution. Plus, again, upcycling, which I think I'd call those raspberry crumbles upcycling of something that may otherwise have gone to waste. That when we talk to the food service customers, they can find uses, no problem.
Oh,
Yeah.
for sure.
All right, I love this question. What are the pitfalls with freezing? I'm wondering if some surplus items really don't work with freezing. Um, and also, I think that applies to food banks as well.
I think the pitfalls are interesting personally, just because a lot of it's about consumer behavior or user behavior. When the frozen product arrives, it's in a great state, but then you got to handle it properly as a consumer or business. And so maintaining that cold chain, or not maintaining the cold chain, is where the problems start to occur from a food safety or quality perspective. So maybe that's the challenge, is that it is a temperature state. It requires maintaining the temperature state. And it requires good temperature monitoring, good handling practices, good equipment maintenance, and the usual good business practices that keep product from not spoiling in the first place.
And Liz, maybe you could talk about like what are some products if you were running a food bank that they don't freeze well.
Well, a product that wouldn't freeze well, cottage cheese comes immediately to mind. And the USDA, by the way, has a great website where they provide information on how long certain foods stay fresh in the freezer and which foods are just not meant. So dairy products are really not great. I mean, cheese is fine, but milk and cottage cheese, immediately eggs would, at least before you crack them open. But whole eggs, certainly I wouldn't freeze.
No, but you
I would
can
add,
crack eggs open and
Yes,
scramble them, and then you can freeze that.
certainly can. You
Also,
certainly
eggs are
can.
good 3 to 5 weeks after the sell-by date, so you may not need to freeze them, even if you think you do. And
Dana, I was
milk,
going to challenge your waste-free cookbook.
yeah,
The waste-free
um,
kitchen. You have the scrambled eggs example in there that you can,
I
scramble
do.
them first, then freeze them. So practically
Scramble them
anything can
raw.
be
Don't cook
frozen.
them. Don't cook them. Scramble them
Yeah.
raw.
Scramble.
Freeze them raw scrambled. That makes sense.
And the sell-by dates are problematic and use by dates because people, consumers do throw food away when it's perfectly fine to eat. So
Yeah.
that's
Can I
what's
add also just
maybe.
quickly, I saw somebody in the chat mention zucchini. The thing that I learned about freezing product that I didn't realize is because you're freezing the moisture within a product, zucchini or celery, anything with high moisture, is when you freeze it, it's just that freezing punctures the cell walls, which then degrades the crispiness of the product. So it doesn't degrade the safety of it. It just means the quality is going to be different. So that the celery, when you take it out, it's mushy because those cell walls have been punctured by the freezing process.
Yeah.
Still good. It's just you're just going to just expect a different experience and use it in a stew or something versus thinking it's going to taste exactly the same as when it was fresh.
Or
Yeah.
even like watermelon, if you freeze that, it's going to be mushy, but then it would be great in a smoothie. So just how are you going to utilize it after?
And it really, texture, I would say, is the primary impact of freezing foods that, quote, don't freeze well, right? But they don't freeze well typically because of texture. You mentioned milk, Liz. We freeze milk all the time, and we do this thing where, like, we're about to go on vacation and there's still stuff in the fridge, and we open our freezer and we literally just stick everything we can in there, including milk, which sometimes separates
Yeah.
depending on the type of
Yeah.
milk, but it's fine, I mean, you kinda know that, and then you can still use it. And then some of the ones I love are pasta sauce because I can never use a whole jar of pasta sauce and then it goes bad, but I literally stick half a jar of pasta sauce in the freezer. Pasta, you can freeze. So many things people don't think of. So I encourage everyone on this call to just like experiment a little bit, throw some stuff in the freezer, see what happens. Mostly the worst thing that happens is that the texture changes. And then, like you're saying, with celery, you cook with it, you don't eat it raw. Typically, most of the food that you freeze, you don't eat raw, with the exception of maybe like stuff in smoothies and things like that.
I remember I was a member of a CSA a couple years ago and I had so many greens, there's that kale season and you just keep getting kale and kale. And I ended up just trimming it, washing it, and sauteing it. Of course, it went from this giant mass down to just nothing. But then I froze that in individual bags, little freezer bags, squeeze the air out. And then when I was making pasta dishes or lasagna down the road, I pulled out that cooked spinach. So if you just take that time with a high water food like spinach, which wouldn't freeze great, I don't think, on its own, but just cooking it, mounds of it, you end up with a small amount, label it, and then you've got that for future delicious, nutritious meals.
Right. All right, I have to share in the chat, we're getting some great tips. You're welcome to keep them coming. We have freezing tofu actually helps separate the water for cooking, and even a better texture depending on what you're going for. Freezing flour and nuts extends the life. So dry foods can be frozen too if you have room in your freezer. I put nuts in my refrigerator, actually, it keeps them fresh
Yeah.
as well. There is a question about sell-by dates that I can't help myself but answer, which is that which is to clarify that the dates on food are generally not about safety. They are generally about quality. The industry and typically are okay to eat if they look fine, smell fine, taste fine. There are a handful of foods that the industry, whoever's putting that date on the food, the manufacturer does intend for you to be a little bit more careful with it. The challenge right now is there's not a really good way to know which products those are. And so there is a bill in Congress called the Food Date Labeling Act that we hope you will all call your congressman to support. It is meant to standardize the way food date labels are done so that one is to indicate quality and one is to indicate safety. The industry in the meantime has moved in a voluntary way towards this two-date system. And so when you see the words best if used by on a product, that means that you can use that product if it looks fine, smells fine, tastes fine. Best by is also used for that. When you see the words used by, those are the products to be a little bit more careful with after the dates. All right. I'm gonna ask you guys for your last call to action in a moment, but before I do, I can't end this call without Liz telling us about freezer burn. Can you
Oh,
eat stuff with freezer burn, Liz?
can you what?
Eat food that has freezer burn.
Yes, you can. So freezer burn is when food is exposed to air and then it dries out. So you might see white, dry patches on your food. It's not a food safety issue, it's a food quality issue. So you can just simply cut it off and it's perfectly safe to eat. And then we often will see ice crystals on frozen foods. I was making a smoothie today and I pulled the banana out of the freezer. There were some ice crystals on it. It's fine. I put it right into the smoothie. You could rinse it off. You could scrape off the ice crystals. But when it comes to freezer burn, just cut it off. Not a safety issue, but a quality issue.
There you have it from the expert. All right. Well, we are running out of time here. So would love to hear from each of you, kind of your final thoughts and call to action for the audience here today. And apologies that we didn't get to all of the questions, but I'm glad we got to hit on a bunch of them. Kai, let's start with you.
I'll summarize succinctly to say, the freezer is your friend and shop your freezer. Don't forget about the freezer.
Danielle.
My call to action, frozen fruits are great in smoothies, but they're also great to snack on their own. So Dana, you mentioned your son loves frozen mango. That's my favorite, and my second favorite is frozen cherries. Love cherries, can only get them good quality fresh ones a couple months of the year. So I would say, be curious. If you have something in your fridge, just try it as a snack on its own, and the mangoes and cherries, I guarantee, will hold up.
Yeah, and you got to get those wild blueberries because their
Oh
season
yeah.
is so short. If you're from New England, you know this. So I'm a big fan of those. My call to action would be to use your freezer in your zero waste meal planning each week. So yes, you have the fridge, yes, you have the pantry, but include the freezer in your everyday meal planning.
I love that. Yep. I like to buy some fresh products for salad and whatever, but then I always have frozen for like, I didn't get to the store yet. I can still have, a good healthy meal with that. Well, this was a fun combination of kind of industry perspective and people, just what we can do in our homes. So thank you to everyone for joining us. for the webinar today. With that, that is all we have time for. Appreciate you, Kai, Liz, and Danielle for the lively conversation. To everyone for listening and chiming in so much on the chat. We will be sending out an email with a recording of the webinar, so you can send it on to all your friends who need these tips. And hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks so much, everyone.